To the former Republican Party, it's time for you to know the real history of the Second Amendment, which is the key to understanding all of American history. The big lie wasn't just about this last election. You've been lied to for centuries. In the early 1600s, when James VI was King of England, he believed he was ordained by God to be king of the whole world, including these lands that were occupied by over 70 million native people, far exceeding the entire population of Europe. Those English lords first brought indentured servants to build shelters and tend livestock, grow crops, and fight the natives and the colonizers from other European countries. They were outnumbered and terrified, but they were gripped by ambition and a fantasy of divine rights. For 50 years, the lords of the new colonies forced over 1 million Africans into work camps. Predictably, these English tribes faced constant rebellions, native rebellions, slave rebellions, peasant rebellions. The English tribes lived in a continuous state of terror, and they believed that there were devils all around them, threatening their God-given rights to rule the New World, and they responded violently. The Salem witch trials in 1692, they exemplify that paranoia. 30 women found guilty of witchcraft, 19 executed by hanging. And what they thought was witchcraft was anything that appeared foreign. Anything new or different was from the devil. These English tribal lords, warlords, they were fanatical about the control that they imposed on those that they ruled. Every tribal colony had their own set of laws describing how the lords determined rent and taxes for the peasants living on the land that they were occupying by force. And as time went on, these English lords, they began describing these laws as their rights. These aren't liberties they're establishing for the peasant class. These are authorities that they're taking from the monarchy and giving to themselves. Virginia's Declaration of Rights includes the authority to command the peasant class serve in Virginia's military. And that law reads as follows, Section 13, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Take note of that phrase, body of the people. The body of the people means the citizens that actually occupy the colonies. The church used a similar expression. The body of the church just means the parishioners, the flesh. When we say the church, we're talking about leadership, the official word of Jesus Christ on earth. When these British subjects decided to create a country for the people, they weren't talking about the body of the people, but personal ambition. And they used every argument at their disposal to whip support for their new hierarchy, which continued to include forced labor, indentured servitude, wage slavery, and a strict caste system. Now, around that time, there's a savage officer of Virginia's militia, a wealthy landowner who, like many of the warlords of the colonies, is getting pretty resentful of the monarchy and their oppressive taxes. And this man complains that custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks that we rule over with such arbitrary sway. That officer's name was George Washington. John Adams, a Boston lawyer, agreed, and he says, referring to the monarchy, that we won't be their Negroes. Not all the English lords thought or talked like that. There was Benjamin Lay. He was an elder in Pennsylvania and a friend of Ben Franklin. He once kidnapped the child of slaveholders to show them how Africans felt. Ben Lay and all the Quakers abolished slavery by the 1760s, expressing in no uncertain terms that holding people captive in work camps was in no way Christian. And there were many other people that agreed, but not the lords of the 13 English tribes, not enough to do anything about it. Their focus was increasing their power and independence from the monarchy, which would require uniting for that reason and none other, which they memorialize in a document called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. This is the first time they call themselves the United States of America, and their agreement includes a mandate that each colony keep ready their peasant militias because they know that war is coming. And war is expensive. So the lords borrow money from France and Spain and the Netherlands to supply rations, ammunition, and arms, and they form a professional continental army who, with the help from the state militias, fight with the full military support of Spain and France for 8 years, which leads to England finally giving up on their colonies in 1783. The former English lords were free from their monarch, but deeply in debt, so they tax the body of the people, just like the king had done to them. And within a few years, the peasants, the farmers, the Revolutionary War veterans, and their families are so overtaxed, they're behind on payments, and there's a national debt crisis. Some Revolutionary War veterans were never paid a cent for their service, are behind on their taxes to pay for that war, and so the lords seize their property. That's the last straw for a New England veteran named Daniel Shays, who gathers 4,000 men to overthrow the tyrannical government of Massachusetts. Well, George Washington and the Founding Fathers are panic-stricken. They get these wealthy merchants in Boston to fund a private mercenary army to back up the Massachusetts state militia, and they crush this anti-tax rebellion. 18 of the rebels are hanged. Daniel Shays is pardoned, but the Boston press calls him an anarchist. And George Washington writes to James Madison, "We are fast verging on anarchy and confusion." And Washington writes letters to other lords. He says, "Commotion of this sort, like snowballs, gathers strength as they roll, if there's no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them. I am mortified." Virginia Attorney General Edmund Randolph is also mortified. His slaves had revolted and joined the British Army, and his father had fled, returning to England, wanting nothing to do with an independent America. Randolph, like so many of the other lords, was terrified about the prospect of anarchy from the laxity of government everywhere. And so James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and the other lords of the colonies, they meet to address the failures of the Articles of Confederation, to maintain law and order, and enforce the collection of taxes. And they agree that they need to centralize power and write a constitution. And the most pressing concern is how to calculate that tax collection and how the states are going to be represented. Well, many of the lords agree with John Adams that very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. But Ben Franklin reminds them that common people also fought for independence. James Madison, he's diligent in making sure this new governing document protects the minority of the opulent from the tyranny of the masses, meaning protect the rich from the poor. And this premise is close to his heart because his grandfather had been poisoned to death by an insurrectionist slave, which awkwardly brings up the question of slavery itself. 10 states had already outlawed human trafficking, but Georgia and 2 of the Carolinas, they threatened to leave if there was a ban. Not only that, but they wanted their forced laborers to be counted for purposes of their state's representation. Well, the northern states, they liked that idea if it meant higher taxes from the Carolinas. And that's where that horrific compromise comes from, counting the victims of human trafficking as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation. Well, there were more than a few people who thought this so-called compromise was psychopathic. Let's take Governor Morris, a delegate from Pennsylvania. He delivered a speech on the topic at the convention. He said, "You mean to tell me the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice?" Well, that's exactly what happened. Governor Morris got it right. In the end, for law and order and the collection of their taxes, the former English lords allowed slavery to continue, allowed a fraction of white men to have voting rights, and gave the slave states unequal representation to placate any further objections and get this tax collection underway. The lords of the 13 colonies were willing to make whatever compromise, whatever deal with the devil required to have the largest tax base possible to pay off their debts and to continue building an empire on par with those European colonial powers that they aspired to be themselves. Ratification of this Constitution was not unanimous. It was by the skin of its teeth. New York approved the U.S. Constitution by 3 votes, but it passed. Authority over the Union was established in the new capital of Washington, D.C., named after the first president and the richest man in the entire North American continent. And now the lords turned their focus back to the war debts. They owed $54 million as a confederation and $25 million as individual colonies. And they never stopped arguing about the balance of power between themselves and a central government, so they wrote a Bill of Rights. And these rights were about them, the lords. They were not about the rights for the peasant class, let alone their own wives, women in general, slaves, or natives. The Second Amendment was one of those amendments. It mandated the upkeep of state militias in case of insurrections against the aristocracy. And the final version you likely know well. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well-regulated means well-trained. The militia is the state military. Being necessary to the security of a free state respects local authority, semi-professional part-time troops rather than a standing professional army, which would have been rejected as a new monarchy, and also taken too many men out of the labor pool, which was the Union's most important commodity. The right of the people primarily referred to James Madison and George Washington and the lords of the colonies, now called states. And it was a given that state military forces were under federal authority. They had already written that into the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which gave Washington the power to call forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. There was an original version of the Second Amendment that was passed by the House, and it had an additional provision to allow for religious objection to military service, but that was stricken. The Lords weren't taking any chances because the insurrections began almost immediately. Alexander Hamilton, who was born in a British colony in the West Indies, he became the Secretary of the Treasury, and he had a great idea how to pay off the war debt with a new tax on whiskey. Well, that was not popular. In 1791, farmers rebelled. They start talking like the Lords. They say they don't want to be taxed without representation either. And in Pennsylvania, they tar and feather the tax collector. Pennsylvania law enforcement sends out a messenger with warrants for their arrest. Well, the rebels grab the messenger, whip, tar, and feather him as well. So Hamilton calls for military action, but there's some disagreement whether this requires congressional approval. So the U.S. Congress soon passes the Militia Acts, which give direct authority to the president to take command of the state militias in times of imminent invasion or insurrection, just so there's no confusion. The acts require all military-age free adults to stand for service to enforce the laws of the Union, to ensure domestic tranquility. Every free, able-bodied white male citizen between 18 and 45 has to sign up. Now, slaves, Africans, natives, they're not allowed to apply for the next 70 years because they are the ones the militia is most expected to be used against, along with the white labor class, which is exactly what happens when a U.S. Marshal arrives in West Pennsylvania in 1794 to collect the whiskey tax and 500 armed men march up to stop him. President Washington gives orders for over 10,000 militiamen to be provided by Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and he leads a federal militia army into Pennsylvania himself, and he squashes the anti-tax rebellion before it becomes a rolling snowball. He later writes, "This is how a well-regulated militia should be used to serve the government in maintaining a strong security in each state, as the Second Amendment of the Bill of Rights intended." Now, the government's right to regulate weapons on an individual basis, well, that was an entirely separate issue, and it was never controversial. The colonies rarely allowed Black Americans to own guns, even if they were considered free. There were laws against selling arms to Native Americans or Catholics. Throughout the 1700s, every gun had to be registered. You couldn't carry guns around town, and certainly not loaded. There were gunpowder restrictions. In Boston, there was a fine for having a loaded firearm in your house or barn. Same in the 1800s. The most famous shootout in U.S. history at the OK Corral between Wyatt Earp and his longtime enemies. That was over Tombstone, Arizona's ordinance against having a gun without a permit, which even for cowboys of the Wild West was common sense. In most towns, you checked your gun before entering, you received a token, and got your firearm back when you left. There was no such thing as concealed carry in southern states. That was banned, and the courts repeatedly asserted their rights to regulate firearms as they saw fit. And it was the same in the 1900s. In 1934, an old Union soldiers' gun club called the NRA testified in support of the first federal law to crack down on machine guns favored by mobsters. In 1959, 60% of Americans favored banning handguns altogether, according to a Gallup poll. Through the 60s and 70s, the NRA and California Governor Ronald Reagan pushed for gun control, especially when they saw armed Black Panther members patrolling Oakland neighborhoods. The Republican Party platform included restricting the sale of cheap handguns. But the civil rights movement had started a panic in white America. They elected Nixon in support of his law and order campaign, that age-old dog whistle for cracking down on insurrections. In that century, it was Martin Luther King's march in Birmingham and labor strikes in Detroit. But it was in the 70s that the NRA began dumping millions of dollars into propaganda to overturn 2 centuries of legal consensus over the meaning of the Second Amendment. The new gun lobby spoke directly to Americans with a deep tradition of paranoia. the one that they'd inherited from the British Puritans of Salem, Massachusetts, who then, over the centuries, like some horrific game of telephone, had twisted the Gospels of Jesus, which preached unconditional love and care for the poor and oppressed, into battle hymns for tribal warfare, justifications for the confiscation of land, and tribal domination with violence and cruelty. A so-called Second Amendment remedy was grown from the crime scene that is American soil, a remedy for any witchcraft outside the walls of the colony that might threaten its Puritan citizens sent here by God, a gross embodiment of personal ambition, greed, and power. The gun made people feel protected, safer, but of course it did the opposite. In 1991, the retired Chief Justice Warren Burger, a conservative Nixon appointee, described the NRA's lobbying efforts to rebrand the Second Amendment as a protection for individual gun rights, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat, the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Finally, in 2008, after 2 more decades of lobbying, and thanks to a final push from a few libertarian lawyers, a right-wing activist court ruled that the country could ignore the first half of the Second Amendment and disconnect it completely from military service and just pretend that it supported the new popular politics of the time. Justice John Paul Stevens, another Nixon appointee, called it the Supreme Court's worst decision of his tenure, and today there are fewer gun laws in Tombstone, Arizona than there were in the 1800s under Wyatt Earp. The meaning of the Second Amendment has been turned completely upside down. It was created to squash insurrections, never to justify them. Its purpose was to draft the white labor class into protecting the interests of their white lords and masters. You've been used, former Republicans, as your ancestors were used. You've been spun so far around for so long that you think in an epidemic of mass shootings of churchgoers and school children that it's Jesus Christ who wants you to keep buying guns, who wants you fantasizing about them, who wants you taking them everywhere you go into shopping centers and schools, who wants you concealing them and then parading them around, marching with them, marching for them. So you have a choice. You can keep yourself shackled to the ghosts of those English tribal lords who claimed God himself commands you defend their hierarchy with your life in their long war against reality. But you know that road is a dead end. You can also choose another path, and you can unite with a nation that wants to learn from its mistakes, that wants to grow and evolve for the good of all the tribes of humanity. And you can rejoin the land of the living.